Good morning, everyone. This is Tonal Discourse, your destination for all things music theory. I'm Seth Brown, a composer and jazz trombonist.
I'm Graham Thomason, a composer and jazz pianist.
And we're here today to talk to you about our third topic of discussion. This is modes. For those of you that are aware, we're going to be specifically talking about modes of the major scale. So normally Graham Thomason is at the piano, but today I'm actually going to do a little bit of demonstration at the piano. We're going to start off today by just looking at the major scale and how it's constructed. So I'm in the key of C, so here's a C. And a major scale is comprised of 7 notes, with the 8th note repeating. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. Now, the reason that this is a major scale is because of the intervallic content. We can actually see a distinct pattern that happens in every single major scale. So the pattern is, we go a whole step up, then a whole step again, then a half step, then a whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. So the way that we normally think of this is that it is a scale comprised of entirely whole steps with 2 exceptions. There's a half step between the 3rd and 4th note and the 7th and 8th note. Again, the 8th note is the one repeated. So if you take this blueprint of whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, you can apply that to any pitch and you get the same major scale. Let's start on E flat and we'll do the same thing. Whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. And we can apply this to all pitches, and that's how you get all of the 12 major scales. Now, a mode is a little bit interesting because you're starting on a different pitch. This is the most simple way to explain the concept. There's another way to think about it that I prefer that I'll explain after we explain it this first way. So if we take a major scale, let's say we're just still in the key of C major. Right, that's a C major scale. Now if we take the same scale, the same key, and we start on a different pitch, we will get a mode of the major scale. So if we start on the 2nd note, D, and we go from D to D in the key of C, we'll get a different mode. And it sounds like this. This is the Dorian mode and is the 2nd mode of the major scale. Now, the reason that this is important is because there's a different half step, whole step pattern. So instead of your half steps being in between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8 or 7 and 1, they're between 2 and 3 and 6 and 7. So if we look, we have whole steps. There's a half step in between 2 and 3. We go up whole steps. There's a half step in between 6 and 7, and then a whole step to get back. Now, this same trend happens with every single mode of the major scale. So if we start and go from E to E, or from 3 to 3 in the key of C, then we get E Phrygian, which sounds like this. If we go from F to F in the key of C, we get F Lydian. If we go from G to G in the key of C, we get G Mixolydian. If we go from A to A in the key of C, we get A Aeolian. Now wait a minute, we need to stop here real quick because we may know that scale already, but not as Aeolian. What is this sound? Well, that's natural minor. We already recognize that scale. But when we're referring to modes, we think of it as the Aeolian mode. So again, your major scale has its relative minor, which you find by going a minor 3rd down from the root. The same thing applies to modes. We refer to this mode, the natural minor scale, as Aeolian. And then finally, the last mode is the 7th mode, known as Locrian. I'll play it over a bass note so you can really get a sense for it.
And so all these 7 modes have the same key signature, is that right?
Yes, they do. They're all in the key of C in this case, and the same rules would apply to any other key. So the same thing would apply in, say, D flat. If we go from E flat to E flat, or from 2 to 2 in the key, then we would get E flat Dorian. So the same principle carries over in every key.
Cool. So let's give some examples of maybe some tunes that people would recognize that are modal, that come largely from some of these modes that we've talked about. So most pop songs that we can identify with on the radio come from either Ionian or Aeolian, especially ones that we hear today, are largely based in the Ionian, which is the major scale, or the Aeolian, which is the natural minor. But we can think of some other tunes that we might recognize that come from some other modes.
Right, so before we go any further, I should actually clarify that the major scale, so from 1 to 1 in the key of C, when we're referring to modes, we refer to this as Ionian. I forgot to mention this when I went through all of the modes. So remember that major is Ionian. A good way to think about it is it starts with an I, Ionian, 1. You can think of it as 1 to 1, Ionian. Aeolian, which is natural minor, an easy way to think of this is if you're thinking of it in the key of C, it starts on A, Aeolian, A to A, in the key of C. This is the way that I learn the modes and the way that I remember the modes. Of course, in the key of B major, you're not going from A to get Aeolian, you're going from G sharp to G sharp, but you get the idea.
Mm-hmm. So just some quick examples of pop tunes. There's plenty that are both in major, which is Ionian, or minor, which is Aeolian, but let's give a quick example of each. So one that's in a major scale, for example, is Thinking Out Loud by Ed Sheeran. It only uses notes from the major scale. And Despacito only uses notes from the minor scale. But there are some other tunes that we would probably recognize that contain other modes, that use other modes as their basis for composition.
So a great example of a song in a mode that is not Ionian or Aeolian, or major or minor, is actually a little tune called Uptown Funk that you may have heard. It goes a little something like this. Right, so you get the idea. So this uses a 1 chord, which is minor, and then goes to a 4 chord, which in this case is major. So if we think about it, what's the mode that has a minor 1 chord and a major 4 chord? Well, Dorian. It's a very characteristic sound of Dorian. This sort of exposes the importance of modes. We can see that modes carry their own unique sonic qualities to them that are different from major or minor, despite the fact that they contain the same notes, which is why Graham and I both prefer a different way of thinking of modes, as opposed to just starting on a different note in the major scale. Because if we think about it that way, then we only know how to generate the modes, but we're not thinking about the unique sonic possibilities that are available in each mode. So if we think of Dorian and this Uptown Funk, we're going from minor 1 to major 4. That's a really cool sound. I think a lot of people would agree. And the reason that's so unique is it's only found in the Dorian mode, at least in all of the conventional modes. So based on that, we can see that every mode has its own unique sound. So now we need a good way to explain those sounds. So when I think of Dorian, I don't think of from D to D in the key of C, or from 2 to 2 in some major scale. I think of it based on its own individual half-step, whole-step combination. And in this case, we can see that Dorian, I'm starting on E flat just to point an example, goes whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, whole step. So with Dorian, we can see that the half steps are in between 2 and 3 and 6 and 7. So these are important to remember, and it's important to remember the types of chord qualities that you have with each mode as well. So just to show this example, I'm in the key of E major. So Our 1 chord is major, our 2 chord minor, 3 is minor, 4 is major, 5 is major, and then if we add a 7, it's dominant. 6 is minor, 7 is diminished, and 1 is major. Let's say we're in the key of E Dorian. Versus E major. So each chord is going to have a different quality than what you would see in major. So in Dorian, we see that the 1 chord is minor, the 2 chord is minor, the 3 chord is major, the 4 chord is major, the 5 chord is minor, the 6 chord is diminished, the 7 chord is major, and then again the 1 chord is minor. So we can see that each chord contains a different quality than we would see in major, and the same applies for all modes. So briefly, we're going to go through every mode and talk about the quality of each chord. So we've done major and we've done Dorian. So now Phrygian, we'll just go from E to E. We have minor 1, major 2, major 3, minor 4, diminished 5, major 6, minor 7, minor 1. Lydian, which is notable for having a sharp 4, major 1, major 2, minor 3, diminished 4, major 5, minor 6, minor 7, major 1. E Mixolydian, which is notable for having a flat 7, major 1, minor 2, diminished 3, major 4, minor 5, minor 6, major 7, major 1. Now Aeolian, which is the same thing as minor. Minor 1, diminished 2, major 3, minor 4, minor 5. Again, normally in minor we would actually raise it to create a dominant 7 chord, but in natural minor or Aeolian it's a minor 5, major 6, major 7, minor 1. And then finally here's the odd one, and we'll talk about why it's odd in just a moment. E Locrian, which is the 7th mode, has a diminished 1, a major 2, a minor 3, a minor 4, a major 5, a major 6, a minor 7, and a diminished 1. Now, here's the thing. It's very difficult to make a diminished chord tonic or home because it's a diminished chord. It's unstable because of the tritone or the augmented 4th or diminished 5th. In this case, it's a diminished 5th because E to B flat is a diminished 5th. So you can't really tonicize a diminished chord, and that's why Locrian is so uncommon. You will see occasional examples of songs in Locrian, but Locrian is extremely uncommon because you can't tonicize the 1 chord in any conventional way. I mean, I suppose you could just jam out on some minor thirds and make it feel like home, that sort of thing, but again, very, very uncommon stuff. So I think that just about covers it for this episode. We talked about the 7 modes of the major scale. Now, again, going forward, there are modes of other scales, namely synthetic scales. We'll do an episode on that in the near future. But a mode is any scale that you derive from taking a previously existing scale and starting on a pitch that isn't 1. So in the major scale, 2 is Dorian, 3 is Phrygian, 4 is Lydian, 5 is Mixolydian, 6 is Aeolian, 7 is Locrian, and 1 is Ionian. Now this will also apply to synthetic scales, and that's something that we'll talk about later.
Yes. And one brief disclaimer is that just because you have something in one key signature doesn't mean that it has to use a mode from that key signature. You can have one key signature used and actually have a mode that comes from a different major scale. For example, in some tunes that use D Dorian, you might see a B flat in there because they still think of it as D minor. However, you will see a lot of Bs are marked natural. And things like that happen all the time.
Right, and that gets down to the fundamental idea that modes shouldn't be thought of as they relate to the major scale. Think of them as their own unique sound. We have a tendency to compare certain modes to the major scale and certain modes to the minor scale, and I'll quickly debrief on this. We can think of the Ionian mode or the major mode, the Lydian mode, and the Mixolydian mode as related to the major scale, because they both contain a major one chord. We can also think of Dorian, Phrygian, and Aeolian, or natural minor, as all related to minor, because they all contain a minor one. Again, the oddball here is Locrian. It has a diminished one chord. It kind of is its own thing. So I think that pretty much wraps it up. And if you like us, share us online. Show us to your friends. Show us to your teachers. Whoever. Music theory is awesome, and we want to spread as much information as we can and make just learning about music as fun as possible in these very quick and easily digestible videos. So thank you again. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button, and we will see you next Tuesday. Signing out.